When we think of World War II, we see the same images. The beaches of Normandy, the ruins of Berlin, the liberation of Paris. But 14 years before Nazi Germany surrendered, another war had already begun, a war so brutal that it would claim an estimated 15 to 20 million lives across China and East Asia, yet today remains largely unknown in the West. This is not a story about forgotten victims. This is a story about deliberate erasure. According to Oxford historian Rana Mitter, whose research at the University of Oxford has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of this period, China's war with Japan was the longest and one of the bloodiest theaters of the Second World War. Yet Western powers systematically minimized and ignored systematic atrocities that rivaled anything perpetrated by Nazi Germany. The question we must answer is this: why were these crimes deliberately sidelined, and how did China's own internal divisions amplify this tragedy? On the night of September 18, 1931, a small explosion damaged a section of railway track near Mukden in Manchuria. Japanese military officers of the Kwantung Army blamed Chinese dissidents. Within hours, Japanese forces had occupied Mukden. Within months, they controlled all of Manchuria. Historians today, drawing from documents examined by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in 1948, know the explosion was staged by Japanese officers themselves. This was the Mukden incident, and it marked the true beginning of what China calls the 14-Year War. While the West would not recognize a state of war in Asia until 1941, China had already endured a decade of invasion, occupation, and systematic brutalization. For 6 years after Mukden, Japan consolidated control over Manchuria, established the puppet state of Manchukuo, and prepared for total war against China. Then came July 7, 1937. At the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged fire. Unlike the staged incident at Mukden, the Marco Polo Bridge clash remains disputed in its origins, but its consequences are beyond dispute. Within weeks, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China proper. Beijing fell in July. Shanghai, after 3 months of brutal urban warfare that killed hundreds of thousands, fell in November, and then came Nanjing. The capital of nationalist China fell to Japanese forces on December 13, 1937. What followed over the next 6 to 8 weeks has been documented by the UNESCO Memory of the World program as one of the most systematic campaigns of mass murder and sexual violence in modern history. According to the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which tried Japanese war criminals from 1946 to 1948, more than 200,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers were murdered in Nanjing. Some historians, citing Chinese sources and contemporary documentation, place the figure closer to 300,000. The Tokyo Tribunal heard testimony describing organized massacres along the Yangtze River, where Japanese soldiers machine-gunned thousands of bound prisoners, then bayoneted survivors. The tribunal documented systematic rape, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 80,000 women and girls assaulted. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Bodies filled the streets for weeks. But here is what makes Nanjing not an aberration but an emblem. It was policy. This was not rage spiraling out of control. This was doctrine. In 1940, the Imperial Japanese Army formalized what became known as the Sanko Sakusen, the Three Alls policy. Kill all, burn all, loot all. According to research compiled by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in their World War II in the Pacific Overview, this policy was applied systematically across occupied China, particularly in areas where communist guerrillas operated. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were surrounded, all inhabitants massacred, all structures burned, all food stores seized or destroyed. The goal was to create uninhabitable zones where resistance could not survive. Historians estimate the Three Alls policy alone resulted in over 2.7 million Chinese deaths. Now let us return to Nanjing, because within that horror lies a crucial piece of evidence that demolishes any claim that the West did not know. John Rabe was a German businessman and Nazi Party member living in Nanjing when Japanese forces arrived. Rabe, along with other Western missionaries and businessmen, established the Nanking Safety Zone, a designated area where they attempted to shelter Chinese civilians. Rabe kept detailed diaries. He documented murders he personally witnessed. He photographed corpses in the streets. He recorded testimony from rape survivors. He wrote urgent letters to the Japanese embassy, to German authorities, to anyone who would listen. His diaries, now preserved and published, provide day-by-day documentation of the massacre as it unfolded. American missionary Minnie Vautrin kept similar records, documenting hundreds of women who sought refuge at Jinling College, describing the trauma they endured, detailing Japanese soldiers who broke into supposed safe zones to drag women away. These were not rumors. These were contemporaneous accounts by Western eyewitnesses who sent their reports home. Western journalists were also present. Frank Tillman Durden of the New York Times reported from Nanjing in December 1937. His dispatches described mass executions and widespread atrocities. The Reverend James McCallum, an American surgeon at Nanjing University Hospital, took photographs of victims and wrote detailed accounts that were sent to mission boards in the United States. This documentation reached Western governments and media organizations in real time. The question is not whether the West knew. The question is why the West chose not to act and ultimately chose not to remember. But before we answer that question, we must understand the full scope of systematic brutality, because Nanjing and the Three Alls policy represent only part of the picture. In 1932, the Imperial Japanese Army established a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit in Harbin, Manchuria. Initially designated the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, it became known as Unit 731. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 conducted experiments on living human beings. According to documents declassified by the United States government decades after the war, as examined by historians including Sheldon Harris in his comprehensive research on Japanese biological warfare, Unit 731 infected prisoners with plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens to study disease progression without anesthesia or treatment. They performed live vivisections. They conducted frostbite experiments by exposing prisoners to extreme cold, then testing methods of tissue damage and rewarming. They tested grenades and flamethrowers on living subjects. They performed forced amputations and organ removals on conscious victims. The prisoners, referred to by staff as logs, included Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Korean independence activists, and Allied POWs. Estimates of the death toll at Unit 731 and its satellite facilities range from 3,000 to over 10,000 individuals. But the full horror extends beyond the facility itself. Unit 731 deployed biological weapons in the field. Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities including Ningbo and Changde. Chinese-led water supplies were poisoned with cholera and typhoid. According to research cited in the Origins article from Ohio State University titled China's Bitter Victory, these biological attacks caused epidemic outbreaks that killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians, with some estimates reaching into the low millions when secondary spread is included. General Ishii and his subordinates were not prosecuted at the Tokyo Tribunal. Instead, in a decision that reveals the darkest aspects of post-war geopolitics, the United States granted immunity to Unit 731 leadership in exchange for their research data. American occupation authorities determined that the biological warfare information was valuable for U.S. programs, and that exclusive access to this data outweighed the pursuit of justice for the victims. The Soviet Union conducted separate trials of some Unit 731 personnel in 1949 at Khabarovsk, but these proceedings were dismissed by the West as communist propaganda. The full truth about Unit 731 did not emerge in Western discourse until investigative journalism and declassified documents brought it to light decades later. Now we must understand why China could not effectively resist this onslaught and why that internal weakness contributed to the catastrophic death toll. China in 1937 was not a unified nation. Since the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912 and the subsequent warlord period, China had fractured into competing power centers. By the 1930s, two major factions dominated. The Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, controlled much of eastern and central China from their capital at Nanjing. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had survived Chiang's extermination campaigns and established a base in Yan'an after the Long March. These two forces despised each other. Chiang had spent years trying to eliminate the communists, viewing them as a greater threat than Japan. His strategy was to unify China under nationalist control first, then confront external enemies. The Japanese invasion forced a recalculation. In December 1936, Chiang was kidnapped by one of his own generals in the Xi'an incident and compelled to negotiate with the communists. The result was the Second United Front, an uneasy alliance to resist Japan. But according to Rana Mitter's analysis, this alliance was always fragile. Chiang continued to distrust Mao, hoarding resources and limiting cooperation. Mao pursued his own strategic objectives, using the war to expand communist base areas. Intelligence was not shared. Coordinated operations were rare. Each side prepared not just to fight Japan, but to resume their civil war the moment the external threat receded. This division had devastating consequences on the battlefield. The nationalists, commanded by Chiang and his German-trained officers, fought a conventional war of large-scale engagements. They poured resources into set-piece battles, attempting to hold cities and strategic points. The Battle of Shanghai in 1937 cost the nationalists their best troops, elite German-trained divisions that suffered catastrophic casualties in 3 months of urban fighting. Subsequent battles at Suzhou, Wuhan, and along defensive lines saw hundreds of thousands more nationalist soldiers killed or captured. The nationalist strategy was to trade space for time, hoping that international intervention or Japanese overextension would eventually turn the tide. Chiang moved his capital from Nanjing to Wuhan, then to Chongqing deep in the interior, determined to continue resistance no matter the cost. The communists pursued a different strategy. Mao articulated a theory of protracted people's war, relying on guerrilla tactics, village mobilization, and political organization. Communist forces avoided large-scale engagements, instead ambushing supply lines, assassinating collaborators, and melting into the countryside. This approach minimized communist casualties and maximized political gains, as the CCP established shadow governance in rural areas. But it also meant that the heaviest conventional fighting and the heaviest casualties fell disproportionately on nationalist forces. The fracture extended to how territory was governed under occupation. Japan controlled the coast and major cities, but struggled to pacify the vast countryside. Puppet governments were established, including the reorganized national government under Wang Jingwei, a former nationalist who defected to collaborate with Japan. But in many areas, nominal Japanese control was contested daily by guerrillas, bandits, and local militias of uncertain allegiance. According to Ohio State's Origins article by Rana Mitter and others, this created a nightmarish patchwork where civilians could not predict who controlled their village from one week to the next, and reprisals from all sides drove the death toll ever higher. By 1944, China had been at war for 13 years. Millions were dead. Vast regions were devastated. Famine ravaged areas where scorched earth tactics had destroyed crops. The nationalist government in Chongqing was isolated, reliant on supplies airlifted over the Himalayas after Japan cut the Burma Road. Yet China remained in the war, tying down over 1 million Japanese troops who could not be deployed to the Pacific. This was China's bitter victory. Survival at unimaginable cost, with minimal recognition or support from allies who prioritized other theaters. Which brings us to the central question. Why did the West ignore these atrocities? The documentation was there. The eyewitnesses were Western. The scale was undeniable. Yet the rape of Nanjing, the Three-Alls policy, Unit 731, the deliberate starvation campaigns, all of it was minimized, sidelined, or erased from Western consciousness. The answer lies in 3 intersecting failures: Eurocentrism and racial bias, strategic prioritization, and post-war geopolitics. First, Eurocentrism and racial bias. Western media and governments in the 1930s operated within deeply racist assumptions. According to analysis by multiple historians, including those writing for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, suffering in Asia was consistently framed as less urgent, less comprehensible, and less morally significant than suffering in Europe. When Japanese forces massacred hundreds of thousands in Nanjing in 1937 and 38, Western media coverage was fleeting. Durden's New York Times reports caused a brief stir but faded quickly from front pages. In contrast, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, just 2 months after the Nanjing massacre ended, Western media devoted sustained, intense coverage, even though the Anschluss occurred without mass bloodshed. The racial calculus was clear. Chinese lives were not valued equally to European lives. This bias extended to atrocity reporting. The Holocaust, rightly, has become a central moral reference point in Western memory. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews is taught in schools, memorialized in museums, and recognized as a defining horror of the 20th century. But the systematic murder of 15 to 20 million Chinese, often through methods as brutal as anything the Nazis perpetrated, remains obscure. When Unit 731's vivisections and biological warfare are discussed at all, they are treated as footnotes, not as crimes on par with Mengel's experiments at Auschwitz. When the Nanjing massacre is mentioned, it is often minimized or relativized in ways that Holocaust denial would be immediately condemned. Second, strategic prioritization. Even after the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Roosevelt administration adopted a Germany first strategy. According to declassified documents and historical analyses, including Mitter's work on Allied strategy, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that defeating Nazi Germany was the paramount objective. The Pacific Theater, including China, would receive lower priority. This decision had brutal consequences for China. Chiang Kai-shek repeatedly pleaded for increased material support, for more airlift capacity over the hump, for a second front in Burma to reopen ground supply lines. He was promised much and delivered little. General Joseph Stilwell, the American liaison to Chiang, was tasked with reforming Chinese forces but was given minimal resources. The bulk of American production, troops, and strategic attention went to Europe and the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, not to supporting China's ground war. This prioritization was not merely strategic. It reflected underlying assumptions about whose suffering mattered and which allies deserved full support. Britain fought to defend its empire, including its colonial holdings in Asia, but spent relatively little effort supporting Chinese resistance compared to resources devoted to North Africa and Europe. The Soviet Union provided early support to China before the Nazi invasion, but after June 1941, Stalin's focus turned entirely to the Eastern Front. China was left to bleed, its massive casualties acknowledged in passing but never prioritized. Third, post-war geopolitics and selective prosecutions. When the war ended in August 1945, the priorities of justice were immediately subsumed by Cold War calculations. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo from 1946 to 1948, did prosecute Japanese war criminals. General Iwane Matsui, who commanded forces during the Nanjing massacre, was convicted and executed. Prime Minister Heike Toja and others were held accountable for waging aggressive war. But the Tokyo Tribunal was compromised from the start. Emperor Hirohito, in whose name the war was waged, was granted immunity by the United States. General Douglas MacArthur and the Truman administration determined that maintaining the emperor was essential for managing occupied Japan and countering Soviet influence in Asia. So the man who sat atop the chain of command was never charged. Unit 731's leadership, as already noted, received immunity in exchange for data. Lower-ranking personnel scattered, many resuming careers in medicine and academia. Biological warfare crimes were deliberately excluded from the Tokyo Tribunal's scope because American authorities wanted to keep the data classified. Moreover, many of the tribunal's findings about atrocities in China were minimized in Western media coverage. The trials received far less sustained attention than the Nuremberg proceedings. When Japanese nationalists in later decades began to deny or minimize atrocities, including the Nanjing massacre, they found space to do so partly because Western institutions had never fully integrated these crimes into the post-war moral consensus, the way the Holocaust had been integrated. Cold War politics amplified this erasure. As China fell to communist control in 1949, the Western narrative shifted. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, defeated and exiled to Taiwan, were recast as tragic Cold War allies. Mao's communists, now ruling the mainland, became the enemy. Japan, transformed under American occupation, became a crucial Pacific ally against communism. In this new context, dwelling on Japanese wartime atrocities became inconvenient. American strategists needed Japan rebuilt and rearmed. Reminding publics of Nanjing or Unit 731 risked complicating that alliance. So the atrocities were quietly set aside, mentioned in passing if at all, never granted the sustained moral and educational focus given to Nazi crimes. Chinese attempts to keep memory alive were dismissed as communist propaganda. When the People's Republic of China established memorials and published accounts of Japanese atrocities, Western audiences, conditioned by Cold War binaries, viewed these as exaggerations or fabrications designed to serve Mao's ideological purposes. It became easier to forget than to confront the uncomfortable truth that an American ally had committed mass atrocities and that America had shielded key perpetrators for strategic gain. The consequences of this erasure persist today. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, opened in 1985 and expanded in 2007, stands as China's most prominent site of memory for wartime suffering. It houses extensive documentation, survivor testimony, and excavated mass graves. Yet it remains largely unknown in the West. Meanwhile, the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo enshrines the spirits of Japan's war dead, including 14 Class A war criminals convicted at the Tokyo Tribunal. When Japanese politicians visit Yasukuni, it provokes outrage in China and South Korea, but often puzzlement in the West, where the historical context is poorly understood. Western media frequently frames these disputes as examples of Asian inability to move past old grievances, rather than as legitimate responses to ongoing denialism and historical revisionism. Japanese history textbooks have been a recurring flashpoint. Successive Japanese governments have approved textbooks that minimize, euphemize, or omit discussion of wartime atrocities. The Nanjing Massacre is sometimes reduced to the Nanjing Incident, with casualty figures disputed or left vague. Comfort women, the term for women and girls systematically coerced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military, are described in passive language that obscures state responsibility. South Korean and Chinese governments have repeatedly protested these revisions, but Western governments have largely remained silent, unwilling to jeopardize relations with a key ally over history education. Yet this is not merely about the past. The failure to fully reckon with the Asia-Pacific War creates ongoing instability. Sino-Japanese relations remain poisoned by unresolved historical grievances. Territorial disputes over the Senkaku or WWII Islands are inflamed by historical mistrust. Nationalist movements in Japan invoke an imagined past of honor and sacrifice, conveniently omitting the co-prosperity sphere's brutalities. Chinese nationalism, meanwhile, uses the memory of Japanese atrocities to legitimize Communist Party rule and justify military expansion, framing current policies as necessary to prevent a repeat of past humiliations. Without a shared, honest accounting of history, the region remains trapped in cycles of resentment and suspicion. How do we answer the central question? Why were these systematic atrocities deliberately minimized or ignored by Western powers? And how did China's internal political divisions amplify the tragedy? The atrocities were minimized because Western powers operated within racist frameworks that devalued Asian lives, pursued strategic priorities that subordinated China's suffering to European theaters, and after the war, allowed Cold War imperatives to override justice. Chinese internal divisions amplified the tragedy because the nationalist-communist split prevented unified resistance, allowed Japan to exploit political fractures, and ensured that resources were hoarded for post-war civil war rather than fully committed to defeating the invader. The result was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, one that claimed as many or more lives than the Holocaust, yet remains obscured in Western memory. The Tokyo Tribunal itself, despite its compromises, documented this clearly. In its judgment, delivered in November 1948, the tribunal stated, and these are the words recorded in the official proceedings, that the evidence presented regarding the massacre at Nanking, the systematic burning and looting throughout occupied territories, and the widespread abuse of prisoners and civilians demonstrated a pattern of atrocities that were not isolated incidents, but the result of policy either secretly ordered, willfully permitted, or deliberately ignored by Japanese authorities. The tribunal concluded that these acts constituted crimes against humanity and violations of the laws of war. Yet within a few years, this judgment faded from Western consciousness. UNESCO's recognition of the Nanjing Massacre documents as part of the Memory of the World program in 2015 represented an important act of preservation. The documents include survivor testimony, burial records, photographs, diaries from both victims and witnesses, and contemporary reports. China's submission of these documents sparked Japanese government protests, with Tokyo threatening to withdraw funding from UNESCO. That response itself is telling. 70 years after the fact, official acknowledgement of documented atrocities remained politically contentious. The ethical imperative here is the same as it is for the Holocaust. Never again should mass atrocities be committed. Never again should the international community turn away. Never again should racism determine whose suffering merits action. Never again should geopolitics override justice. These are not empty slogans. They are demands for structural change, for educational reform, for a truly universal human rights framework that does not create hierarchies of victimhood based on race or strategic convenience. What does this demand of us today? First, education. The Asia-Pacific War must be taught with the same rigor and moral clarity as the European theater. Students learning about World War II must learn about Nanjing, Unit 731, the Three Alls policy, and the broader campaign of atrocities across China and Asia. This history must be integrated into curricula, not relegated to specialized courses or regional studies. Second, accountability. While most perpetrators are now dead, the historical record must be unambiguous. Japanese textbooks must be honest. Official denials must be challenged. Yasukuni shrine visits by serving politicians must be recognized for what they are, endorsements of a narrative that honors war criminals. Third, reconciliation rooted in truth. Germany's post-war reckoning with the Holocaust, however imperfect, provides a model. Official apologies, memorials to victims, education that confronts rather than obscures crimes, integration of that history into national identity in a way that says never again, not as victors but as those who learned from horror. Japan has issued statements of remorse, but these have been periodically undermined by revisionist comments from politicians or approvals of whitewashed textbooks. Genuine reconciliation requires consistency and courage. Fourth, resist the weaponization of memory. Historical grievances are legitimate, but governments can manipulate them for nationalist purposes. The Chinese Communist Party uses the memory of Japanese atrocities to bolster its own legitimacy, while often suppressing domestic historical inquiry that might implicate its own actions during and after the war. Honest memory requires confronting all atrocities by all parties without hierarchy or exception. Fifth, recognize the global lessons. The failure to respond to atrocities in China in the 1930s parallels failures in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and Syria. The same dynamics recur. Dehumanization of victims, strategic calculations that prioritize interests over lives, delayed intervention that allows death tolls to mount. The Genocide Convention, adopted in 1948 in explicit response to the Holocaust, has not prevented subsequent genocides partly because the international community learned selectively, memorializing European atrocities while forgetting Asian ones. In conclusion, the suffering of China from 1931 to 1945 was not a forgotten war. It was a deliberately obscured war, sidelined by racism, strategic neglect, and Cold War expediency. 15 to 20 million deaths, systematic rape as a weapon of war, biological experimentation on living human beings, villages annihilated under the Three Alls policy, a capital city subjected to weeks of organized massacre, all documented, all witnessed, all reported, and all minimized in Western memory. China's internal divisions ensured that resistance was fragmented, that casualties were higher than they might have been under unified command, and that the post-war narrative became entangled in communist-nationalist rivalry. But the greater responsibility lies with those who had the power to act and chose not to, with those who had the power to remember and chose to forget. This history is not the property of one nation. It belongs to humanity's collective memory of its darkest hours. Just as we say never forget about the Holocaust, we must say never forget about Nanjing. Just as we teach about Auschwitz, we must teach about Unit 731. Just as we honor the resistance fighters of Europe, we must honor the Chinese soldiers and civilians who endured 14 years of war. The dead deserve to be remembered. The survivors and their descendants deserve acknowledgement. And all of us, regardless of nationality, bear the responsibility to ensure that such atrocities are neither repeated nor erased. The sources for this account are extensive and accessible. UNESCO's Memory of the World documentation on the Nanjing Massacre is available online. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East Judgment, published in 1948, provides exhaustive detail on wartime crimes. Rana Mitter's research, published by Oxford University Press and through the university's China Center, synthesizes decades of scholarship. The Ohio State University Origins Program article titled China's Bitter Victory offers clear, accessible analysis. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum includes the Pacific War in its educational mandate, with online resources comparing atrocities across theaters. John Rabe's diaries have been published and translated. Survivor testimonies from Nanjing have been collected and preserved, many now digitized. Read these sources, share them. Insist that this history be taught. When you encounter minimization or denial, counter it with evidence. When geopolitics threatens to obscure atrocities, refuse to let convenience override truth. This is not about assigning collective guilt. It is about establishing collective memory and collective responsibility. The 20th century demonstrated humanity's capacity for industrialized cruelty. The 21st century must demonstrate our capacity to remember honestly, to educate comprehensively, and to act decisively when atrocities occur, no matter where, no matter to whom. Never again means never again for everyone. The victims of Nanjing, of the Three Alls campaigns, of Unit 731, and of 14 years of brutal war across China demand nothing less than full inclusion in that sacred vow.